Starlink. Once widely dismissed as an expensive side project, this satellite internet division has quietly become the financial core of SpaceX. It works by beaming broadband from a constellation of thousands of low-orbit satellites down to small dishes that customers buy once and then pay a monthly fee to use. Starlink accounted for $11.4 billion of revenue in 2025, up 48% from $7.7 billion in 2024, representing 61% of total revenue. What makes it different from a typical hardware business is the margin structure. Once the constellation is built and reusable, rockets bring down the cost of maintaining it. Adding a new subscriber costs very little, while the subscription keeps generating revenue every month. That shift from a capital-heavy science project to a recurring subscription engine is why analysts increasingly talk about SpaceX the way they'd talk about a software company, rather than an aerospace one. Launches? This is the business most people associate with SpaceX, sending rockets into orbit to deliver satellites, cargo, and astronauts for paying customers. It was the company's original source of revenue, built on the premise that reusable boosters could make spaceflight dramatically cheaper than anything competitors offered. The Falcon 9 is expected to exceed 150 launches in 2026, with operational costs 50 to 70% lower than legacy competitors like Blue Origin or Arianespace. But the twist is that most of those launches no longer serve outside customers. Of 165 Falcon 9 launches in 2025, only 43 were for outside customers, with nearly 3/4 used internally to deploy Starlink satellites. In other words, the rocket business now mostly exists to feed the satellite business rather than standing on its own as a major profit center. NASA contracts. Government work was one of the earliest and steadiest sources of income for SpaceX, covering crew flights to the International Space Station, cargo resupply missions, and scientific payloads. These contracts gave the company credibility in its early years, proving that a private firm could handle missions once reserved for national space agencies. But the role of this revenue stream has been shrinking in relative terms as other parts of the business expand faster. NASA is expected to make up only about 5% of SpaceX's projected 2026 revenue, a sign of how much the company's priorities have shifted toward commercial and consumer markets rather than public sector work. The dependence has effectively flipped. SpaceX once needed NASA's contracts to survive, and now NASA increasingly depends on SpaceX's launch capability to reach orbit at all. xAI and Grok. This is Elon Musk's artificial intelligence venture, which merged with SpaceX's broader corporate structure to help fund the development of AI models under the Grok brand. Unlike Starlink, this segment is not yet profitable. It requires enormous spending on computing infrastructure just to train and run its models. The AI division had a deficit of $6.35 billion, with SpaceX's first quarter 2026 capital expenditures totaling $10.1 billion, the vast majority of which, $7.7 billion, went toward AI. The reasoning behind absorbing that cost is long-term. SpaceX leadership has floated the idea of running AI computing infrastructure in orbit, framing the company less as a rocket maker and more as an integrated technology utility, even though the near-term numbers show this bet is currently funded by profits earned elsewhere in the business. In practice, Starlink's subscription revenue is subsidizing a costly and unproven AI buildout, a bet that only pays off if Grok eventually becomes a major independent revenue source in its own right. X Platform. Formerly known as Twitter, this social media platform became linked to SpaceX's finances after its ownership was folded into the same corporate family as xAI. Its role in the revenue picture is smaller and less transparent than Starlink's or launches, since much of what it generates gets bundled together with Grok rather than reported separately. The platform serves as both a distribution channel for Grok's AI features and a testing ground for new products. For outside observers, this blending of X and xAI's finances makes it nearly impossible to judge whether the social media business is thriving, stagnant, or quietly propping up the AI ambitions layered on top of it. Advertising. Within the X platform, advertising remains a core source of income generated the traditional way, through brands paying to reach the platform's user base. This revenue has historically been volatile, shaped by advertiser confidence and shifting content moderation policies. It matters to the broader SpaceX picture, mainly as a supporting piece rather than a driver, since it helps offset some of the costs of running X and Grok, even though it comes nowhere close to matching what Starlink or launch contracts bring in. Advertising is best understood as a stabilizer for X's own operating costs, rather than a meaningful contributor to SpaceX's overall growth story. IPO capital. In mid 2026, SpaceX carried out a public stock offering, opening up ownership of the company to outside investors for the first time in its history. The IPO closed with SpaceX raising approximately $85.7 billion in gross proceeds, the largest U.S. initial public offering on record, reaching a post-IPO valuation of $2.3 trillion. This capital does not come from selling a product or service. It comes from investors betting on the company's future growth, largely on the strength of Starlink's subscription numbers. That injection of cash gives SpaceX room to keep funding expensive, unprofitable bets like Starship development and AI infrastructure, without leaning as heavily on operating revenue alone. It also marks a broader turning point for the company, shifting it from a privately controlled venture answerable mainly to Musk and early investors to a publicly traded firm now accountable to a much wider shareholder base. Subscriptions. This is the model underneath Starlink's success and increasingly the lens through which the whole company is understood. Instead of one-time payments for rockets or hardware, subscriptions provide steady, predictable income every month from millions of customers around the world. Starlink grew from 1 million users in 2022 to more than 10 million active customers across 160 countries by February 2026. And it is the reason investors now value SpaceX less like a rocket manufacturer and more like a global connectivity provider that happens to build its own rockets. Taken together, these 7 pieces show a company whose public image, dramatic launches, celebrity founder, ambitious AI plans is increasingly detached from its actual economic engine, a quietly growing base of paying internet subscribers scattered across the globe.